A leak of over 11 million documents has torn down the impenetrable walls of secrecy.
C'est la plus grande fuite de l'histoire du journalisme.
Diese deutsche Zeitung nicht mehr als
11 million documents that have been released.
News outlets around the world analyze the file.
Here with media from all over the world who are demanding answers to their questions.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. We're looking at one media story this week from multiple angles. The Panama Papers, dozens of news organizations, hundreds of reporters chasing thousands of stories, how it all came together and what we're not seeing in the reporting. We'll look at the history of journalistic collaborations in the digital age and how technology makes them not only possible, but necessary. And Julian Assange knows all about covering mega leaks and working with the mainstream news media.
What I want to hear is that there is a path, a transparent path to publishing the vast majority of that data set.
We have an exclusive interview with the WikiLeaks editor-in-chief on how he sees the story. Last Sunday, a big news story broke, the Panama Papers. Big in terms of the scale of the investigation, the amount of information leaked, and the nature of what was revealed about the clients of a Panamanian law firm and how and where they hide their money. According to the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, the ICIJ, which coordinated the reporting operation, there were 376 journalists involved, belonging to 109 news organizations from 76 countries. Multi-newsroom collaborations are growing more common, firstly because in the digital age there is just far more data to analyze, but also because newsrooms around the world are shrinking, while the often secretive institutions they're supposed to cover are growing in both size and influence, which leads to one of the primary criticisms of the first wave of coverage of the Panama Papers, that news organizations went after individuals, political leaders, and some wealthy business figures, but largely shied away from the corporate side of the story and the taxation systems that allow billions and billions of dollars, euros, pounds, and rubles to be hidden offshore. The larger question being, can the corporate-owned news media really be expected to hold the corporate world to account? Our starting point this week is Panama City. This story begins, as most exposés do, with a source, presumably in Panama City, within a law firm, Mossack Fonseca. Although Süddeutsche Zeitung, the German newspaper in Munich, the source reportedly first contacted more than a year ago, has never confirmed that. SZ insists it still does not know who the source is or where. When the scale of the leak, 2.6 terabytes of data, 11.5 million documents in multiple languages, became clear, SZ needed help and went to the ICIJ in Washington. A virtual newsroom was built using encrypted technology, connecting all of the players. And as journalists from dozens of countries within the consortium dug through the material, SZ and some of its international partners met in Washington, Munich, Lillehammer, Norway, and London. All of that happened over the course of 14 months before the story broke, Sunday, April 3rd.
We're live, everyone.
We're trending.
Already.
Turning an anonymous, secretive law firm in a small Central American country into a household name, and its clients into news stories.
En gerir svo allt saman, en allt gefið upp til skattsprófari.
En hvaða eignir í félag? Hvaða eignir í félag?
When the first data arrived, we realized how unbelievably vast the quantity was and that nearly the whole world was affected. We knew that we couldn't manage the data and research it on our own, so we brought some partners on board. We have a very good relationship with the ICIJ, which is why we turned to them and the journalists from The Guardian and said, let's do it together. We can't do it alone.
What we're seeing here is almost 40 years of records of a law firm in Panama called Mossack Fonseca. And so what's interesting about this is that the records go up to December 2015. So it's not historic, it's almost in real time. And you're able to look at this like parallel universe that's always been shrouded in secrecy. So we're now blowing away the secrets.
I know one of the ICIJ reporters, his name is Will Fitzgibbon, and so he just got in touch with me because there's a Kenyan aspect to the case. He showed me how to access the data and how to use the virtual newsroom that they had set up for that purpose. Journalists deal in information. Information is our currency. And then all of a sudden you just have access to the largest amount of information that you've ever had at your disposal.
The ICIJ agreed to have a listening post camera in its Washington office the day the story went live, Sunday, April 3rd. According to the consortium's rules, the story was to be embargoed until 2 p.m. Washington time. But some news outlets involved could not resist jumping the gun, if only just.
5 minutes to go until we're supposed to be live, but everyone's going live already because people are cheeky like that.
12 amtierende und ehemalige Staatschefs.
Money laundering, sanctions dodging and tax avoidance.
The world has been hit by one of its biggest scandals.
The initial rush of coverage, its breadth, scope, and reach, was something to behold. Within 48 hours, the Icelandic Prime Minister would resign over his links to the law firm. Russian President Vladimir Putin was implicated, as were the presidents of Argentina, Ukraine, as well as many other political heavyweights, footballers, and celebrities. But there was a pattern to the coverage, typified by The Guardian in the UK. It had a tasty domestic angle to pursue, that Prime Minister Cameron's late father used the law firm in Panama to set up a company in the Bahamas to avoid taxes. But The Guardian, at least on day one, looked past 10 Downing Street and the Cameron angle and went all in on the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin.
People tend to remember the first 24 hours, and then as a story progresses, interest tends to peter off. So therefore it was in our Western media's interests to promote an angle which they think people would immediately grab and take an interest in. The Putin angle is also a very helpful diversionary technique to try and swerve the story away from the fact that the UK control the majority of these offshore islands, and the huge swathes of companies that are registered from the UK, especially London, is quite mind-boggling.
The reason that Russia got so much attention initially was, apart from the fact that I think there's actually a really good story to be told about Russia, is that when we put questions to the Kremlin about a week before publication, they actually contacted us individually. I think at that point Putin and the Russians thought it was just about them, whereas in fact, as we knew all along that it wasn't. It was actually about people from almost 200 different countries, and we had presidents and prime ministers and kings all over the world that we were about to I guess, make revelations about.
We asked The Guardian to comment on the Kremlin-centric aspect of its early coverage, but none was offered. Focusing on individuals may make the Panama Papers stories more marketable, but it means less attention on systemic issues and corporations, many of which are no strangers to offshore operations and tax shelters. Many of those following the story online have commented on the fact that the vast majority of news outlets are owned by corporations. They see those outlets as riddled with potential corporate conflicts of interest, even some that are publicly funded, such as Britain's BBC.
A big part of the Panama Leaks story is about corporate evasion and corporate avoidance. However, the chairman of the BBC Trust, Rona Fairhead, is also a director of PepsiCo. PepsiCo operate out of Bermuda. And then if you look at News Corporation, operated and run by Rupert Murdoch, he was known to have 136 subsidiaries of that one organisation, one most notably the Century Fox Films, which operates out of Panama. So to say that the Western media may not focus on corporations, I'd say it's probably a safe bet.
We wanted to focus on public officials because we didn't want anyone to think that what we were doing wasn't in the public interest. And because we're so many public figures, it wasn't that hard for us to make that choice. And we have in the past reported on corporate tax avoidance. In fact, our organisation has probably led to more change in that area than any other news organisation in the world.
The ICIJ has also been questioned, as has Süddeutsche Zeitung, for not making the entire database available online, the way WikiLeaks did when it collaborated with mainstream news outlets. As the consortium's Gerald Ryle put it, we're not WikiLeaks. We're trying to show that journalism can be done responsibly. The consortium argues it has editorial reasons to limit access to the database. SZ says its policy on that is dictated by German law.
I'm not criticizing WikiLeaks for what they do a different thing, but we want to reclaim journalism And basically we want to do it in this way. We want to basically publish things that we think are of public interest. Day after day after day, going in there, looking through documents, and then going outside the documents to actually put context around what you're seeing, and acting responsibly as journalists. So I make no apology for that.
According to German law, we as a German newspaper can't just publish this data under any set of circumstances, as it contains a large amount of personal information concerning people's privacy. We can publish something, and that's what we are doing, when there is an indication of criminality. For example, tax evasion, money laundering, financing of terrorism, etc. But if they own a shell company and pay their taxes, even if their name appears on the Mossack Fonseca database, that in itself is not a reason to report on this.
Our audiences, they need to be patient, because journalists are still going through these files. We have barely scratched the surface of what the Panama Papers mean. So I'd say that it's not that we have decided whose story needs to be told. Maybe we have decided whose story needs to be told first, but eventually I want to believe that everybody who's adversely mentioned in the Panama Papers, sooner or later, their story is going to be told as well.
That remains to be seen. But every reporter involved in the Panama Papers Consortium would have known, before they posted their stories, what would follow.
I want you to take a breath and bask in the glory of getting a project out. Yes. And then get ready for the panic that is inevitably going to come.
They knew that their journalism would be scrutinized, their agendas questioned, and consumers will, as they say in the news business, watch this space, and this one, 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 and this one. We live in the age of digital journalism, one of the hallmarks of which has been the mega leak. Consider how much has changed. Back in 1971, a military analyst at the U.S. Department of Defense, Daniel Ellsberg, decided to leak what came to be known as the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times.
Certainly, Matt, I'm very pleased at the way the newspapers have acted to defend the First Amendment now.
Ellsberg, who exposed that the Vietnam War had escalated and that the Johnson administration had lied to the U.S. Congress about it, was initially charged with espionage and conspiracy, but the case was later dropped. And when the war ended in 1973, Ellsberg was credited by many for playing a central role. What Daniel Ellsberg furnished the Times with was considered to be a huge dossier, 7,000 pages that he photocopied and sent to the paper. But had the documents been contained in a modern text file, they would have only taken up a couple of dozen megabytes. It was nearly 40 years after the Pentagon Papers, in July of 2010, that WikiLeaks, the organization founded by Julian Assange that obtains, vets, and publishes classified documents, built its first multimedia partnership around the Afghan war logs. The Guardian, the New York Times, and Der Spiegel worked alongside WikiLeaks, going through 90,000 documents to reveal details about the war that neither the American nor Afghan government wanted to be made public. 3 months later came the Iraq war logs, another 400,000 files. WikiLeaks was honing its media strategy, expanding its list of partners to include Al Jazeera, Le Monde, as well as the Bureau of Investigative Journalism and the Iraq Body Count Project. By November of 2010, and the publication of the U.S. diplomatic cables, WikiLeaks' partnership with mainstream media outlets had mushroomed to include newspapers like Spain's El País, Lebanon's Al Akbar, as well as newspapers in Sweden, Russia, and Cuba, among many other countries. The cables classified communications between the U.S. State Department and its network of diplomatic missions around the world revealed frank, unvarnished assessments of governments and leaders far and wide. They created a political sensation and were credited by many in Tunisia with triggering the revolution there that would spread and grow into the Arab Spring. Come 2013 and the Edward Snowden leaks, the National Security Agency in the U.S. and other security services, including Britain's GCHQ and their political overseers, all had some explaining to do. The Snowden files, again captured and sent in digital form, revealed the extent of the NSA's internet and phone surveillance in a multitude of countries, including the tapping of phones belonging to foreign leaders, including Chancellor Merkel in Germany and Prime Minister Rousseff in Brazil. Also in 2013, the Washington, D.C.-based International Consortium of Investigative Journalists made headlines with a 260-gigabyte leak on offshore tax havens and the national leaders and politicians funneling money out of their countries into secret companies and trusts. The consortium worked with The Guardian, Le Monde, Süddeutsche Zeitung, and The Washington Post, as well as the CBC in Canada. A year later, the ICIJ exposed tax avoidance schemes of more than 300 multinational companies based in Luxembourg. 80 journalists were reportedly involved from media organizations around the world. And last year, the ICIJ led a team of journalists from 45 countries on the Swiss Leaks project. 60,000 leaked files relating to the secret accounts of clients working through the Swiss private banking arm of HSBC. With leaked data sets getting larger, cooperation between news outlets is becoming standard operating procedure. As we just saw with the Panama Papers investigation, outlets that once were chasing the exclusive, the scoop, are now willing or maybe feel compelled to join forces with their competitors and to even keep a lid on juicy stories for months or longer, all in the spirit of collaboration. One organization that really honed the practice of multi-newsroom operations was WikiLeaks, when its founder and editor-in-chief, Julian Assange, decided to partner with a few news outlets on the Afghan war logs. He created a reporting model that would go on to grow larger with more and more partners. Assange has been living in the Ecuadorian embassy in London since August of 2012. He sought asylum there when prosecutors in Sweden overseeing a sexual assault investigation were calling for him to be extradited. Assange says that he fears that in Sweden he would then be at risk of being extradited to the US, where he could be tried for espionage. We went to the Ecuadorian embassy in London to sit down with Assange and discuss the Panama Papers, multi-newsroom collaborations, as well as how to handle leaked documents. But we started out by asking him about where this story began, the source, the whistleblower. What kind of person would reveal all those secrets and why?
Assuming they were an insider or they were an individual computer hacker coming from the outside, this is a technical person, or this person had help from a technical person. I think it's likely that this represents radicalization of the technical class. That's something that we've seen, for example, with Snowden. So these usually young men who are technically educated know how to extract material. But of course, they have to have the idea. And the idea is given to them by successful examples. And now there have been a range of successful examples.
But it's also to do with hardware, though, isn't it? Because back in 2010, most journalists at most news organizations wouldn't have had a clue about encryption. Back in 2013, when Snowden came out, most Guardian journalists he was dealing with, he had to school on encryption. Now, so many news outlets are providing these boxes, these, for lack of a better term, safe havens for data that 5 years ago, only organizations like yours and a few others did. That's a big change as well, isn't it?
Well, I don't believe that Süddeutsche got their material that way. However, their journalists have been educated in the technology. But it's no surprise that it was a German newspaper, because Germany is the center of technical education of journalists, and is also the center of the political radicalization of the technical class. Both of those two things combined.
The head of the ICIJ said that ICIJ, the consortium, has no plans to release the full data set. He said, we're not WikiLeaks, we're trying to show that journalism can be done responsibly.
Yeah, that's a concern. So we're very pleased about the work that SZ, Süddeutsche Zeitung, did in the beginning in developing that source. We think that's really good work. The work of the source, of course, is the most impressive. And then pulling together that collaboration is also impressive work. Saying that you're going to censor and not release a lot of the material, in fact, what must be 99% of the material, that's a big problem. It's fine to have some kind of staggered release because you want to balance the supply and demand curve. But what I want to hear is that there is a path, a transparent path to publishing the vast majority of that data set, because that's what's interesting from a legal perspective, from a historical perspective. One of the fundamental missed lessons of the WikiLeaks experience is about how to deal with scale. Okay, one part of dealing with scale is stitch together a big international collaboration, get more bodies, more eyeballs on the material. The other way to deal with scale is the scale that is inherent in the material. When you've got millions of documents, you need to make millions of documents available, citable. So it's not just a few hundred journalists, it's all the lawyers in the world. It's all the police in the world.
As someone who pretty much wrote the book on multimedia outlet collaborations, you knew that this stuff was coming. When you saw the first wave, the first 2-3 days of reporting, what stood out for you, and what did you not see that you thought you would in the reporting?
Well, we've been covering offshore sector for a long time, since 2007. In fact, WikiLeaks has used the offshore sector for protection from banking blockades, so we even had to research it for our own purposes. But in terms of the initial angling of the story, that can be a bit strange. There was clearly a conscious effort to go with the Putin bashing, North Korea bashing, sanctions bashing, etc. But for some reason, some papers, like The Guardian, thought that that was necessary.
Have we seen any other examples in the parochial reporting, media outlets from various countries doing what The Guardian appears to have done, which is point at a distant target while not paying as much attention, proportionally speaking, to a domestic target much closer to home?
Sure, that was done in Sweden with SVT, the Swedish state TV, beating up on Iceland. Iceland's a small Scandinavian neighbour, sort of viewed as quite provincial and fun to beat up on. But the Swedish trusts were not really examined.
Am I the only one who's surprised that more than 100 news organizations can get involved with a story like this, and somehow in an industry that is famous for rumor mongering and incurable gossips, they managed to keep a lid on the whole story until it came out?
I think it is interesting. We knew, we know other people in other news organizations who knew, but who didn't say anything, I think because no one knows of the law firm concerned. It doesn't have name recognition. Then the individual details are, they're quite technical. You can't tweet this story. You can't spill the beans with just a small comment. So I think there just wasn't the market to do it. Could also be that so many news organizations were involved, so they had incentives to not report.
The other thing that strikes me about this is that we're sitting in an embassy in London that you are not free to leave. And a lot of politicians, primarily in the United States, but also elsewhere, when the leaks came out in 2010, they turned you into the embodiment of the problem. And in a way, it kind of reminds me of that Napster story, a free musical service that the music industry went after in a big way, destroyed in a court of law, and woke up the next morning and found out that Napster wasn't their problem. The technology was their problem. There is no music industry, per se, compared to what there was before today. And I'm wondering if you feel like that now would be a good time to point out that you weren't necessarily their problem. Their problem is the technology, and you can't lock that up in an embassy in West London.
Look, WikiLeaks set an example, and the example was the threat. And the example was a threat because the technology, over time, became more available to other people who could then follow the example. Looking forward as to how I think the Panama Papers will go, it's going to be very hard to get reform without a bulk publishing effort. There's just not the mass to deal with the reliance that the establishment of the UK, the United States, and in fact most countries have in the offshore sector. Now, what you have in practice at the moment is basically a two-tiered tax system, where the middle class and the working poor pay income tax, and the wealthy essentially don't pay anything. That's a question about the structure of society, and that big picture is not being engaged with in the journalism it has done. It is, oh, North Korea, oh, Russia, oh, sanctions breaking, oh, maybe someone dodging inheritance tax a little bit. But there is a big picture here as well.
Stories that we can put a face on. They like to do the stories that they can put a face on.
You know, scandals and stories you can put a face on can be good for marketing reasons. But what are you marketing in the end? What WikiLeaks does, and what I believe should have been done with this story, is that the scandals are there to market the archive, because it's the archive that has the scale, that can deal with the problem.
This isn't the first time we've covered a mega leak and the multi-newsroom collaboration around it. It won't be the last, but there's a shift in how audiences are receiving their reporting. Secretive governments, powerful individuals, and shady corporations are all being scrutinized, and so too are the news outlets doing the journalism. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.